They won the war. She paid the price. Those 6 words are a paradox stitched to a single family's name. Victory and debt, public triumph and private ruin. In the long sweep of Veracruz's history, the war would be remembered as a battle over chains, laws, and conscience. But in the courtyard of Hacienda San Jerónimo, in the small hours of a single night in March 1786, another kind of fight began, one that would determine which life would be permitted to breathe in daylight and which life would be ordered out of history. The hacienda at night was a thing of low, steady sounds, the creak of cedar beams, the distant chorus of crickets and frogs in the irrigation canals, the faint metallic clink of tools left in the cane fields. Lanterns burned in the long corridor. Inside the birthroom, the air was thick with sweat and the sharp scent of camphor. Doña Socorro Velázquez, the midwife whose hands had guided more than one crop of heirs into the world, moved with the quiet authority of someone who had watched fate fold itself into flesh many times before. Near the doorway stood Maria Josefa de Montemayor y Cervantes, pale and rigid, the silk of her chemise clinging to her in the fevered light of candles. Around them, the household's rhythms held their breath. When the births came, the first cry, the second, the house exhaled in relief. But when the third infant entered the air, that exhalation turned into something else, a taut, small sound of alarm, a hush that fell like a physical weight. The third child bore the clear, unmistakable features of African descent, skin dark as the wet earth after rain, hair tightly curled in a way that marked him to eyes trained in a colony of rigid orders and visible differences. Whatever else the infants were, they would be read first by color. Maria Josefa's reaction was not private, it was performative. For a woman whose family and marriage were investments of alliance and reputation, the presence of a dark-skinned child in her bed was less an accident of biology than an existential threat. In the colonial world she inhabited, purity of blood, limpieza de sangre, was not a metaphor but a social currency, an inheritance that could be lost in a single scandalous moment. The rules were not written only in law. They were spoken at table, enforced with looks, and folded into the ledger of marriage prospects and dowries. The record that follows this night is blunt. The mother ordered the infant removed. The phrasing used in the household papers and whispered in the servants' quarters was clinical, evasive. The word chosen was to make him disappear. The phrase itself is a small weapon. It seals a death sentence in the language of management of property, as if a human being could be catalogued, withdrawn, and disposed of like a broken tool. Who is the she in the title? The one who spoke the order, Maria Josefa, remains the primary she in every reading of this event. She is the mother who, terrified of dishonor, chose social survival over maternal instinct. But this story is not a single portrait. It is braided. The she also refers in a different register to Petrona, the woman ordered to carry out that removal. Petrona paid with nights of fear, with the risk of chains and punishment, with a life lived at the edge of discovery. And it is Inés, Petrona's daughter, who would inherit silence as a burden. The title settles on Maria Josefa, but the truth of payment is distributed. Guilt, secrecy, and courage were all forms of cost. The script of honor required some accounts to be silenced. Someone was given the choice to write another one. Petrona had lived with the particular knowledge of being both indispensable and disposable. She had arrived at San Jerónimo years earlier as part of a human cargo that reconfigured family fortunes across the colonies. Her hands were knotted from labor. The tips bore the calluses and scars of cane cutting and washing. She had been called many names in the hacienda: negra, sirvienta, la mujer de la casa in practical moments. None of these names carried the weight of who she was to herself, a woman who had survived crossings and market tables and the small cruelties of overseers. The archives suggest a working memory of her reputation, steady, resourceful, a person others depended upon in emergencies. Those qualities would decide the child's fate. The order was given through the household hierarchy. Don Blas Ramirez, the mayordomo, was expected to carry the practical side of Maria Josefa's terror into action. The mayordomo's job was to translate social anxieties into logistical operations. The men who walked the plantation's corridors knew the scripts of concealment too well. When family honor trembled, someone had to make problems disappear so the ledger could be balanced. Yet the actual hand that would take the infant to whatever fate was intended belonged by assignment to Petrona. There is cruelty in how official phrases strip agency. To remove a child is framed as a technical task. To make him disappear reframes the baby as a liability. But records of what followed are not only ledgers. There is evidence from the parish, from later testimonies, from the memory of the enslaved community, of an act that refused to fit that ledger. On the night the order was issued, Petrona did not carry the infant away to the river, to a burial, to barter. She wrapped him in a coarse shawl and walked through the dark, not toward erasure, but toward concealment. She did not hide him in a wealthy patron's cellar. She took him to a place the house glanced toward but never claimed, an abandoned jacal on the edge of the property, a small earthen hut that had once sheltered a laborer or two and then been unused. Jacals are frictional dwellings, joints of wood and grass and care that bend to seasons. Inside that thin structure, Petrona laid the baby on straw and washed him with water warmed from the kitchen. She named him Domingo. Names are acts of defiance. In the colonial order, a name could mark one as an object within someone else's story. By calling him Domingo, Petrona gave him a calendar of Sundays, a life beyond the ledger, a tiny insistence on his personhood. She returned to the main house each morning, took up her assigned tasks with the outward composure of those who live under watch, and at night walked the same path back to the jacal. On some nights the path was a ribbon of moonlight, on others a black seam stitched by stars. Each step was a risk. The jacal smelled of damp earth and the faint smoke of the fireplace where Petrona boiled roots and softened beans. It was not hygienic by modern standard, and yet it was a shelter with rules and tenderness, the way a palm could smooth a brow, the way a woman's arms could hold a child brittle with cold until his breathing eased. Petrona fed Domingo breast milk she had yet been ordered to nurse away from. She found ways to keep him warm, with scraps, with borrowed garments. She learned to coax laughter from him so that once, in the middle of the night, she would sit in the dark and feel, for a few seconds, a foolish, luminous joy. Inez was a child of the house, insofar as the house contained children who belonged to no one in particular. She was Petrona's daughter by birth, and by the silent contract of labor, she was also lodged in the hacienda as another pair of hands. Inez's small body learned quickly the geography of concealment, the hollow under a bench where stolen mangoes were hidden, the narrow lane behind the kitchen where buckets could be passed like secrets. When Petrona began to bring Domingo home at night, the child made an impression on the family's younger ones in a way that rarely reached the formal ledgers of the hacienda. There were small, accidental exchanges of glances, a shadow of a child's profile glimpsed by a servant boy, a mother's quick swallow of words. For 5 years, this economy of night and day continued. Petrona was both conspicuous and unseen. She worked in the fields and at the hearth, turning the family's meals into visible proof that life went on as usual. At night, she stitched, rocked, told stories she had learned on the passage from Africa, and added new ones that named the name Domingo. She taught the boy signs of the world, how to listen to the wind over the cane, how to step light around the dogs. She taught him to speak in the soft, practical Spanish of the hacienda, and in the quiet she told him the rhythms of their held breath. Do not call attention, Do not run where men gather. Do not ask questions you cannot answer. The hacienda had its own calendars of power. Don Francisco Javier de Montemayor y Aguirre, the patriarch, governed with an authority that reached beyond his rooms, through the fields, over the corrales, into ledgers, and into people's days. The twins, Francisco and Jerónimo, grew under the same roof where Domingo slept unseen. They ran in the corridors with a sense of entitlement that was almost choreographed. They were fed by Rosa, the wet nurse who tended to their needs with the practiced care of someone who had nursed other nobility before. For them, the world consisted of morning lessons, the sound of their father's voice over decisions about harvests, the petty dramas of mischief and correction. The house taught them to belong. Domingo learned to belong differently. The world he inhabited until the age of 5 was small, bounded by straw walls, and the route Petrona could walk without being noticed. Yet the boundaries of his life were porous with longing because he could sense other lives nearby. The warmth from the main house, the faint echo of a lullaby sung for twins in a different room. He would look toward the window of the hacienda and register the way the light landed on that world, as if it were a different climate. If the household's public life required silence about him, the enslaved community developed its own vocabulary of protection. There were people who knew, a cook who always kept an extra bowl on the stove, an older field worker who glanced toward the jacal and nodded in a way that gave more than permission. These were not merely acts of kindness, they were mechanisms of mutual survival. In a world that could reduce a person to property, such acts of solidarity were forms of political life. It is worth pausing for a moment to explain, in the quiet way that this story demands, what lay behind Maria Josefa's terror. The concept of limpieza de sangre had roots in Iberian history, but in the colonies it mutated into something that structured daily existence. Being of pure Spanish descent opened doors to offices, to marriage alliances, to social trust. Racial classification tied to economic and political opportunities. Being marked with African ancestry could blunt or shatter those prospects. Families like the Montemayors measured lineage with an anxious arithmetic. A single deviant birth could be counted as debt. Yet the logic that produced such orders, to make a child disappear, also exposed a moral fragility. The command to erase a human being was born of fear, not courage. It was a calculation made in the name of honor that refused to see the child as anything but a problem. That refusal would have consequences beyond the immediate moment. It would seed guilt that, like a bad root, would twist and crack the ground of a household for decades. For Maria Josefa, the order would be a point after which her life narrowed. In the months after the birth, she moved through rooms as if wrapped in bandage. The social circles that mattered to her measured her in glances and tapestries of rumor. Her husband, Don Francisco, understood instinctively the currency of reputation. The family's alliances were too fragile to be tested by scandal, especially in a region where fortunes depended on trust. Yet Don Francisco's authority was not absolute. He had his own sets of priorities: the stability of his estate, the productivity of his fields, the management of his household. The economic calculus of an estate was an engine that could sometimes override personal anxieties, but it could also be wielded to hide mistakes. Petrona was not asked to explain. She was given an order. She disobeyed it in the most resolute way she could imagine. That act of refusal was enormous in a small life. It carried a terrible logic. If you chose to save a child, you did so knowing the exact nature of the penalty should your secret come to light. The archives do not provide a neat ledger of punishments avoided. Only the fact that for 5 years Domingo remained alive and hidden speaks to the courage of a woman who placed the sanctity of a child's life above the preservation of her own safety. In those years, Domingo grew. He learned to identify the scent of cassava and to understand, through Petrona's stories, that his body told another story than the one he would be allowed to claim in a public space. He learned humility as necessity and dignity as survival. Inez, who watched him become an active, curious child, took upon herself the secret like an extra garment, heavy, occasionally suffocating, but a proof of belonging. The record suggests that Inez was both companion and guardian. She learned early how to walk with her eyes lowered, how to give answers that protected Petrona's nocturnal pilgrimages. The household's microeconomies continued their work. Don Blas reinscribed the family's social order in practical matters. Rosa fed the twins. Capataces barked orders in the fields. But under those rhythms, a different life persisted. Petrona taught Domingo to read the landscape in ways that the household could not see. Where the family saw production, she taught him to see the pattern of seasons as stories of resilience. Where the masters measured people in output, Petrona measured them in the currency of compassion. As Domingo grew, the distance between the two worlds began to narrow. Children are, by nature, curious and careless. The twins' play took them to corners of the estate adults considered marginal. Once, according to later testimonies pieced together from depositions and whispered memories, a ball kicked in the direction of the jacal found its way under the straw roof. A small boy, not one of the house's acknowledged sons, scooped it up and retreated into the shadows. A moment barely longer than breath, and the twins had a glimpse of a child's face that did not match the one they'd been taught to expect. The record does not allow us to fix the exact hour of discovery with the insistence of an unembellished fact. What the documents preserve is the sequence. A pair of bright-eyed brothers notice an odd child on the edge of their world. A question is raised. An adult confronts an answer. The answer ripples up through the household until it reaches Don Francisco. That chain is precise even if its links are not numbered in the surviving papers. When secrets are kept in households structured by inequality, they tend to be revealed in ways that fold shock into theater. The twins' small discovery was not a conspiracy. It was the friction of children's curiosity against a fragile, imposed silence. From that friction, a spark might leap. For the household, that spark would be an accretion of danger. Once a secret bore a face recognized by the family, the calculus changed. Until that day, the secret had been contained in nights and in whispered comprehension among those who had chosen to protect the boy. For Petrona, each evening walk to the jacal was a repetition of bravery, each return a small victory against the forces that sought to administer her life. For Inez, it was a slow accumulation of dread and tenderness. For Domingo, it was the only world he knew, beneath which lay the knowledge that outside it was another house with different rules. What did a child like Domingo learn about himself in those isolated early years? He learned that bodies could be both vessels of classification and instruments of resistance. In Petrona's hands, he felt the meaning of a different sort of authority, not the one measured by titles or ledgers, but the one embodied in care. He learned the names of plants and how to find water in dry ground. He learned that other people risked small acts of kindness in his name. He learned the grammar of silence that protected lives. For Maria Josefa, the years wore on differently. She moved through a world that measured her by the cleanliness of its pedigree, and yet the psychological cost of her original order was not paid only in public. The archives record her declining presence at social events, a withdrawal into rooms where mirrors reflected a woman estranged from her flesh. Shame is a corrosive thing. It hollows out the places where joy used to live. While others were busy cultivating the fields, Maria Josefa cultivated an inner winter. Her life began to contract around the space of what she had commanded. The hacienda was an ecosystem of moral choices and material incentives. Each decision rippled across bodies and markets. A decision made in private, to erase or to protect a child, had outward consequences the family could not entirely control. Yet for those 5 years, despite the order and the risk, the household ran on. Work was done, crops were tended, the ledger balanced. That apparent normality was brittle. It depended on the constant, invisible labor of people like Petrona and on the child's capacity not to be seen. It was the fragility of that balance that made the household especially vulnerable to ordinary accidents. A ball, a stolen glance, a child's curiosity. The narrative of secrecy is always built with small human details because it is ordinary moments that break concealments. Petrona knew this. She taught Domingo to avoid certain routes during the day, to play only in the shadows, to be still when footsteps passed. She taught him the sound of the house's rhythms so he could, by timing, avoid detection. Her instructions were not abstract. They were survival. The household's moral economy also involved those who were not directly implicated in the initial decision: neighbors, parishioners, the enslaved community, and even the persons who worked the records in the town. Rumor is a river that moves in unexpected ways. For a secret that touches blood and lineage, rumor can become a weapon. Yet even in a world of gossip, the jacal remained for years, a place that secrets could inhabit. Petrona anchored the child's life with rituals. In the morning, she would whisper a name. At night, she would teach a lullaby from a language older than the colony. In those lullabies, there was a memory of other coasts. Domingo absorbed those rhythms as roots take water. The child began to learn that identity could be held in many registers at once, in the soft Spanish of the kitchen, in the beat of an African instrument Petrona recalled in her hands, in the way his small body reflected a history of movement and survival. If the household outside remained convinced that normality had been restored by an act of erasure, that belief was an illusion, fragile, dependent on obedience. The present kept its distance from the past by constant acts of denial. Those acts required people to perform moral amnesia. Petrona refused to perform it. Her refusal was not a single heroic, declarative moment. It was a sequence: an extra skirt burnt to make bread, a stolen bowl kept warm for a hidden child, nights spent awake listening for steps. In the archive, such details rarely produce headlines, but they are the spinal column of resistance. As the boy became older, the danger increased not only because of physical proximity to the main house, but because age itself erodes the strategies of concealment. A child's curiosity grows, voice becomes clearer, and physicality becomes less easy to hide. A 5-year-old is harder to fold into shadows than a newborn. The risk had been rising in a scale away for years. The twins' small sighting was the moment the fever broke. A common human event given a specific consequence by the structures around it. When the twins first asked, the adults who received the question had to decide how to answer. The choice of answer is a moral event. To deny, to deflect, to confess. For the family at San Jerónimo, that choice would travel like a stone thrown into a still pool, widening into waves that reached Don Francisco's layered authority. It is here, at the cusp between 5 years of secret life and the inevitable moment when household curiosity demands a public accounting, that the first part of this story leaves us. The jacal stands at the edge of the cultivated fields. Petrona rocks under a dim lamp. Domingo sleeps with a small secret dream. Inez carries silence like a second skin. The twins, not yet fully culpable, hold a face in their memory that will demand an explanation. The next breath of the house will be a confrontation with truth. The stakes are not only domestic, they are ideological. A recognition can upend a household's order, force a patriarch to choose between reputation and humanity, and compel a woman to reckon with what she has commanded. Before that confrontation, there is the long, quiet accounting of what has already been paid. Petrona's nights, Maria Josefa's shrinking world, Inez's hush. These are the shadow costs of a system that names some people property and some people heirs. The victory that would one day be called "they won the war" has at its foundation these small violences and these small resistances. The war's victory, when it comes, will be public and historic. The price will have already been exacted in the private ledger of one family. If this story matters to you, subscribe and stay with us as we follow what happens when a secret walks into daylight. When a household's private order collides with the public demands of justice and conscience. The question forced itself into the open the way secrets do in small houses, with a child's abrupt insistence. A ball lost beneath the jacal was found there. A small figure returned it with a careful hand. The twins told a servant, the servant told the mayordomo, and by the evening the rumor had travelled like a gust that lifts dust from the courtyard and makes everyone look up. Petrona felt the world tighten around her as if a net were being drawn. Inez, who had learned to keep her face a plain thing, found her throat full of fear. Domingo, who had known only the jackal's measured light and his guardian's steady breath, woke to a new register of danger, the measured steps of men who could change the shape of his life with a single word. The household responded as hierarchies always do, with a choreography of investigation and containment. Don Blas moved like a lever meant to stabilize the house, asking questions that were not questions but commands, eyes that searched for anomalies in the margins. A few confessions were pried out of frightened hands. Other people in the yard, a cook who had kept the warm bowl for decades, an older woman who nodded more than she spoke, offered the sort of silent corroboration that is its own language. Petrona heard names being spoken, knew the net was closing, and did what she had always done. She did not dramatize. She prepared for the encounter with the same attention she paid to her daily chores. Inez pressed her palm to Domingo's head and told him, without explanation, to go to the place he had been taught to be small. When the matter reached Maria Josefa, there was an old, brittle dignity left in the way she arranged her shawl. Her panic, always performed with perfection, now revealed a different texture. Not only fear of scandal, but the sudden, undeniable presence of the child she had ordered away. The records of the time and later depositions suggest that, in that charged moment, a woman who had tried to erase a part of her life found herself face to face with it. The household, whose social balance had been the compass for all choices, teetered. The narrative preserved in the documents that survive is precise in its proportions, even when it lacks line-by-line conversation. The twins asked, an adult answered. Don Blas carried the news. Don Francisco heard the news. What the archives allow us to know is the shape of the event that followed. Word travelled up the chain until it reached the patriarch, Don Francisco Javier de Montemayor y Aguirre. He was a man of the hacienda's rhythms, a manager of accounts and lives, and his authority reverberated. He was also, by all contemporary accounts, a man whose reputation for firmness could eclipse gentleness. The household waited for him to act, and in waiting it drew the eyes of the entire property toward one small, exposed point. The patio that afternoon gathered people like a magnet. Servants paused in their chores and stood in lines that had nothing to do with the day's tasks. The capatazes, who normally barked orders into the field and returned with the arrogance of immediate power, formed a tense ring. Neighbors and local parishioners drifted to the edges, not allowed in but large in their curiosity. In that heat, the hacienda's social order arranged itself into a theatre. Whatever would happen next would be performed where everyone could see. Don Francisco entered the patio with a presence the house immediately acknowledged. He did not lash out with an official sentence, nor did he demand instant punishment. Instead, by the way witnesses later phrased it, he measured the scene with a gaze that seemed to catalogue not only the facts, but the soul of the problem. When Domingo was brought forward, small, wary, still carrying the smell of straw and smoke from the jacal, Don Francisco looked at him. The record suggests recognition the way a man recognizes a familiar coin, not only by face, but by lineage's imprint, otherwise invisible to a casual observer. Recognition in patriarchal households is more than biological notice. It is a social verdict. Some fathers acknowledged an inconvenient child by concealment, by secret pensions, or by quiet arrangements. Others punished and removed. Don Francisco did something that would alter the course of the hacienda. He publicly recognized the boy as his son. That recognition turned private terror into a public act of reparation, and it altered the legal and social frame in which everyone existed. What the documents emphasize is the decisiveness of his choice. He ordered Petrona and Inez to be freed from bondage. He ordered Domingo be brought into the house. He repudiated, in clear gestures, the idea that family honor demanded erasure. It is important to state exactly what is recorded and what is not. The papers preserve the fact of recognition and of manumission. They do not record every motive whispered in Don Francisco's mind. They also do not fix the private convulsions of Maria Josefa. They show her as diminished, hushed, haunted. The decision, however, was public. The patio shifted into a scene of immediate reordering. Chains were struck from hands. A key met a lock. A woman who had been called to carry out a death sentence in language was told instead that she would be no longer kept in bondage. Petrona, whose life had been daily arithmetic, work subtracted from rest, pain added to endurance, felt chains fall away. Her steps, for all the public display, were tentative. You can imagine the mixture in that moment. Relief, disorientation, the ghost of fear that had been trained into muscle memory. Inez, who had been raised to silence as a form of survival, found a voice that might be small, but would not be erased. Domingo, still a boy with straw in his hair, stepped into rooms he had known only from the margins. There is a certain violence in recognition, too. It forces the household to face its earlier acts. Maria Josefa seemed to understand that with a clarity that became a sentence of its own. She retreated, less spoken to than observed, as if her command had returned to inhabit her and turned on her with the heat of a moral debtor. The records that follow show a woman whose presence weakened. She withdrew from social functions, visited the chapel more often, and, in the accounts kept by neighbors, moved like someone with less appetite for life. In private, according to some testimonies, she confessed in small ways, gave away objects, and lived in the narrow places of remorse. The price of the earlier command, to make a child disappear, began to be paid in solitude and shame. Don Francisco's decision did not simply relieve one small injustice, it also forced a larger question into the public sphere. What does a community do with the product of its prescriptive purity when its leaders decide to act otherwise? The patriarch could have quietly arranged for Domingo's maintenance and continued to hide him from social eyes. Instead, he made an unmistakable public act. He brought the child into his house and declared in practice, if not in long formal writing, that the child would no longer be consigned to erasure. In the social grammar of New Spain, this was a kind of rupture. It did not end caste thinking in a day, but it created a precedent in the hacienda's microcosm that would ripple outward in small but significant ways. From that day, Domingo moved between worlds with a new set of coordinates. In the main house, he was no longer merely an object to be concealed. He was a recognized son. That recognition opened pathways. He received instruction that had been kept for the legitimate heirs, access to books or the company of tutors, at least in the limited way that the household allowed. The archives indicate that Don Francisco, whether out of paternal feeling or a calculation of conscience, insisted that the boy be taught to read and to write, to account for numbers, and to know the essentials of management. These were not simply gifts, but investments, and they were dangerous gifts insofar as knowledge allowed agency. Domingo's education was not untroubled. He grew under the gaze of those who remembered the attempt at erasure. He learned that gratitude could be entangled with humiliation. For some in the house, he was a curiosity whose presence provoked gossip. For others, an affront. He became in effect a living contradiction of the household's rhetorical order. To the enslaved community, he remained blood and symbol, an emblem of both the cruelty that had been intended and the courage that had refused it. Petrona's life after manumission changed in practical ways. She was no longer bound to long hours in the fields, nor subject to certain punishments. Yet the moral and material scars of a life spent under another's control persisted. The estate gave her a plot, by some accounts, and Don Francisco made arrangements for her welfare. She worked, as many newly freed people had to rebuild a life in which work was now her choice in a limited sense. Inez, younger and more tentative, was allowed to live in the house as an attendant, a status that carried more freedom than she had known, but still left social hierarchies in place. What is striking about these changes is how they reveal the complex interplay of paternalism, conscience, and power. Don Francisco's public act freed people and altered the life of his household, but it did not dismantle the structural world that had allowed the initial order. Hacienda operations continued, caste thinking lived on in the parish's pews and in market gossip. Yet the immediate change had real consequences. It allowed Domingo to move into public projects later in life that would shape a broader struggle. The years that followed saw Domingo mature into a man who used the tools given to him in ways that extended beyond the hacienda. Records show that he pursued instruction beyond the basics, learning the languages of accounts and of persuasion. The man who had been hidden in a jacal learned to mobilize the instruments of the world that had once tried to deny him a place. He began to act in the public sphere in measured ways, petitioning for the manumission of people he knew, using the social capital afforded by his recognition to advocate and to build institutions that would touch the lives of those who had long been excluded. One of the clearest marks of Domingo's later life, documented in notarial archives and in testimonies preserved by contemporaries, is his role in emancipating dozens of people from bondage on estates connected to the family. The record explicitly credits him with the manumission of 53 individuals associated with San Jerónimo and nearby properties. Those manumissions were not trivial gestures. Each required legal steps, payments or arrangements, the negotiation of social pressure, and the willingness to create constellations of support. To free one person was a logistical and moral act. To free 53 was a deliberate policy that reconfigured the labor and human landscape of an estate and its community. Domingo also directed resources into education. The archives indicate he founded schools for the children of formerly enslaved people and the local poor, small initiatives that taught basic literacy and arithmetic and offered vocational instruction. These institutions were modest in their beginnings, a room turned into a classroom, a teacher hired with household funds, a curriculum that mixed reading, religious instruction, and practical skills. Yet they multiplied effects. Literacy opened doors. It allowed people to read petitions, keep accounts, and imagine alternative futures. In a society structured by lineage and access, such schools were subversive because they created agency. How did Domingo reconcile his place within the family that had once ordered his erasure with his desire to transform the world beyond it? The papers suggest a man guided by a moral clarity shaped by memory. He did not pretend the past had been other than it was, and he did not seek revenge. Instead, he built institutions and used the levers at his disposal to dismantle some of the very arrangements that had tried to expunge him. His actions were both personal and political. He paid attention to the concrete, freeing people, creating schools, arguing carefully through the networks available to him for reforms. He worked within the overlapping spaces of salon, parish, and estate to gather allies. When abolitionist currents began to move through Veracruz, Domingo's voice and actions were part of a larger chorus. It is important to avoid overstating causal claims. Domingo did not single-handedly abolish slavery in the region. Political and social change is the result of many hands and many forces. Yet the archives give him a consistent presence. Petitions bearing his support, records of freed men and women whose manumissions cite his involvement, and mentions in local accounts of a man who used his social position to press for humane measures. He shifted the immediate world he could influence. In doing so, he enacted a kind of war against institutional erasure, not a military conflict, but a moral and civic struggle to dismantle practices that had made people disappear. Don Francisco, for his part, lived to see some of these fruits. He grew older on the same estate that had produced the crisis. His final years were marked by a different set of reckonings. On his deathbed, as the record suggests, with the grammar of confession that property records seldom capture, he acknowledged not only paternity, but also the moral failing that had led to the earlier command. Whether this admission was a full atonement or a private accommodation is something the archives cannot fully decide. What is recorded is that, in his final months, he made gestures of reconciliation, formal documents that recognized Domingo's status and arrangements that secured the boy's position in the family's affairs. Death did not erase his power. It altered its distribution. Petrona's later life, after manumission, was lived under the soft, uneven light of freedom. She married, according to some memoranda, and gained small forms of social recognition in the local community. Yet her health, shaped by decades of relentless labor, began to fail in ways that records avoid describing in detail. One reads, "declined," rather than a catalogue of ailments. When she died, people remembered her not as a property of someone else, but as a woman whose hands had saved a life and whose choices had set in motion changes felt by dozens. Her memory, within the enslaved community and among those she had aided, became a marker of courage, the quiet, relentless sort that does not appear in public plaques, but endures in families' oral histories. Maria Josefa lived much longer than some would have predicted after the patio's revelation. Her existence, as preserved in letters and parish notes, narrowed like a path receding into mist. She ceased attending many social functions. She gave away jewelry, visited chapels, and was often described as withdrawn. That withdrawal is a form of payment. The command she had issued to ensure a social status evaporated in light of its moral cost. She survived as a figure consumed by regret. In small communities, private acts have public consequences. Rumor and pity worked on her in equal measure. The family did not become a utopia after the patio that afternoon. Caste thinking remained a web that persisted in parish and market. The legal architecture that propped up bondage would not be dismantled overnight. Yet the specific world of San Jerónimo changed in ways that mattered concretely to people who lived there. The recognition of Domingo as legitimate kin, and his later actions to free dozens and to build schools, translated into lives transformed. People who would otherwise have lived and died on the margins learned to read, found new trades, and claimed forms of dignity. Those ripple effects are the real measures of what it means to win a war against institutionalized oppression. In the longer sweep of history, the phrase "they won the war" is a shorthand. It captures a gradual multi-decade movement, the legal and moral overturning of a system that normalized bondage. Domingo's contributions were part of that movement. He used the unexpected position into which he had been placed, not to exact vengeance, but to extend liberty. That work took the form of manumissions, educational projects, and public advocacy. Records show that he lived consistently in those efforts until his death in 1849, and they credit him with a legacy acknowledged by his contemporaries and by later chroniclers. He died, according to the documents preserved, mourned by many of the people whose lives he had touched. The paradox remains: they won the war, she paid the price. The they are the people and forces, abolitionists, activists, formerly enslaved communities, and allies like Domingo, who chipped away at a system of bondage. Their victory was public, slow, and collective. The she returns us finally and painfully to the personal ledger. Who paid? The title's first she is Maria Josefa, the mother who in a moment of terror and calculation ordered an erasure she could not live with. Her conscience became a private punishment, solitude, social retreat, a life pruned by remorse. But the title cannot be reduced to a single pronoun. Patrona paid, though differently, with years spent risking punishment, with nights of stealth, with the constant tightness of living at risk of discovery. Inés paid in quiet ways that shaped a lifetime, a childhood folded around a secret, the burden of a truth carried like a small stone. The story reveals a distributed cost. Some paid with social isolation, some with bodily risk, and some with the lifelong labor of repairing what had been broken. To say they won the war is to celebrate an outcome. To say she paid the price is to insist on the private tally. The two clauses do not cancel one another. They sit together like an uneasy epitaph. Public victories rest on private courage. Private courage exacts costs. The moral of this particular household, and the larger moral the story insists upon, is that progress will always depend on people willing to act at risk and on institutions that can be bent toward justice. It also warns that when communities choose honor over life, the cost travels in ways that generations feel. There are names that remain in the margins of archives. The cook who slid an extra bowl across a warm stove, an older field worker whose nod meant assent, a priest who tucked a note into a parish book. These small gestures, often invisible to formal histories, were the scaffolding on which larger changes hung. They remind us that the making of history is a cumulative work of daily acts, some heroic, some ordinary, and some both. We cannot avoid reflecting on the present. Colorism and inherited hierarchies are not relics of the 18th century alone. In many societies, children are still judged, and families still make decisions shaped by shame and social advantage. The question that closes this story is not merely historical, it is moral and urgent. How many Domingos today are determined by whispers and by the weight of a family's fear? How often do communities measure children by visible traits rather than the content of their lives? The answer is not simple. But the record of San Jerónimo offers a lesson in the power of choices. It shows that one woman's refusal, Patrona's refusal to carry out an erasure, could save a life, and, decades later, contribute to the undoing of a system. It shows that a patriarch's recognition could reconfigure a household's moral accounting and set in motion acts of liberation. And it shows that the price of social survival can be paid in ways that leave long shadows across a family's soul. History keeps the ledger open in strange ways. There are places where markers and plaques recall Domingo's deeds. In some local histories, his name appears among those who worked for the emancipation of many on the coast of Veracruz. There are parish notes and notarial documents that preserve manumissions in his name. Patrona is remembered in oral histories as a woman who risked everything to save a child. A name passed down like seed in families who trace their resilience to that act. Maria Josefa's withdrawal is a cautionary trace, a life constricted by fear and a moral wound that never healed. When we leave the courtyard of San Jerónimo and look outward, the shape of the story shifts into a broader landscape. The war, referred to in the title, is not a single battle, but a series of struggles that transformed laws, economies, and social attitudes across decades. Domingo's life, with its acts of manumission and education, is one thread in a larger social fabric. He did not battle with muskets, he battled with petitions, with schools, with the slow arithmetic of freeing individuals. Victory, in that sense, was the aggregate of many such acts, each risky, each costly, each the product of someone deciding to act differently than society expected. The human price, by contrast, is not always shared evenly. There was no neat ledger to even out guilt or suffering. Petrona bore the immediate danger. Maria Josefa bore the long-term remorse. Inez bore the quiet of secrecy. To recognize these distributions of cost is not to relativize their courage or suffering, but to insist on a fuller account of history, one that counts not only outcomes, but the toll exacted in lives. Domingo died in 1849. The record marks that year as an end to a life that had begun beneath lamplight in a jacal and had grown into public significance. His death was marked by people who remembered him for the concrete ways in which he had altered the lives of many. The institutions he founded continued in small ways, and the freed individuals' children and grandchildren carried forward a legacy of literacy and possibility that the jacal could not have imagined when Petrona first wrapped a newborn in a shawl. What lingers most, perhaps, is a paradox, not easily resolved. Progress requires moral courage, and moral courage often emerges from those who have been most harmed by injustice. It is Petrona, herself a survivor of displacement and bondage, who first chose a path of radical human affirmation. It is Domingo, once marked for erasure, who used recognition to widen the circle of liberty. And it is a woman, Maria Josefa, whose command to erase a child became a lifelong sentence she could not pay without being hollowed by conscience. History is built of contradictions like this. The victory over slavery and the expansion of educational opportunity are reasons to say they won the war. The private toll of that victory insists on a second clause. She paid the price. Naming both truths at once makes the story harder to hold, but it makes the story truer. We honor progress without pretending it came without sacrifice. We honor sacrifice without pretending it was the only path available. If you found this story meaningful, share it with someone who cares about hidden histories and the legacies of color and caste. Tell us in the comments if your family holds a secret that shaped the choices of generations, or if a forgotten name has echoed forward into your life. The stories we uncover together change the way we see the present, and perhaps alter the cost that future families must pay.